I'm going to present on what I've been doing my research on. Same-sex marriage in the United States, challenging the national security imaginary. I'm going to talk a lot about that and the main points of it. And the idea is that there's fear around this idea of homosexuality, of same-sex marriage. We can tell by things like the proposed federal marriage amendment, the Healthy Marriage Initiative, the Defense of Marriage Act. All these things, like ideas as the gathering storm, gives us the idea, or we clearly recognize that marriage then appears to be an institution that needs to be protected. There's lots of fear around it. It seems to be being attacked. So when do we feel fear? When do we get defensive? Either at the individual level or at the state level. When we feel threatened, when we feel threatened, when we feel attacked, when we feel danger. This is when our security is threatened. So we feel insecure. Now I know it seems a little crazy when I first started thinking about these ideas that in what ways could homosexuality threaten the security of the nation? It seems a little crazy when you think about it. And yet clearly there's all this defending of marriage going on. So there's some kind of fear, some kind of people are feeling some kind of attack. So ultimately there is something about gay marriage that makes the nation feel insecure. Makes the nation feel threatened. So when I was starting my research, you have to, choose one research question that really drives it. So the question is, next slide, why and in what ways is same-sex marriage interpreted as a danger or as a threat to the security of the nation? There obviously must be some ways. So in an effort to answer this question, the research included the history of marriage, the early construction of the nation, how the marriage and nation were really constructed together, how I also looked at the contemporary movement to legalize same-sex marriage in the U.S. I did case studies of Arizona and Massachusetts, which were drastically different and really highlighted some of the reasons why it hasn't succeeded in Arizona and why it has succeeded in Massachusetts. I looked at the pros and cons of the debate in those two states. I looked at state laws, legislation and policy, constitutional amendments, and about 5 million newspaper articles. Okay, because there were that many in Massachusetts, and here there were like 70, in Arizona over the years, so that didn't take as long for Arizona. But I looked at the ways the marriage equality movement is interpreted as destabilizing by many of the states in the country and hence overall to the security of the nation. I also looked at domestic partnership rights, at rights of civil unions, and how they were different from the rights and benefits of, civil legal marriage. And there are over 1,300 benefits, federal and state benefits to legal marriage, many of which are denied even through domestic partnership and civil unions. Civil union, sure.
What was the number again?
Over 1,300. And depending on what site you go to, the little numbers after that are a little bit different, but definitely at least 1,300. Some being much more important than others. But the idea being that even civil unions may give all the rights within the state like Massachusetts, but don't give the federal rights if you have civil unions. You just get the state rights, not the federal rights. So there's, in a sense, then domestic partnership and civil unions for homosexual couples consequently give them second-class citizenship. It's not a full citizenship status then if they're denied the rights that citizenship affords other people. I started doing this about all this research and these ideas of how sexuality is tied to the nation have just fascinated me for a long time since I started grad school. And so I really first started looking about 15 years ago at how sexuality connected with the nation. And there's a lot of good literature that started coming out in the 90s on sex in the nation, sexuality in the nation, and different, how sexuality that doesn't fit the norm is then deemed, dichotomously as the abnormal, and then is deemed deviant by society and hence threatening once again to the nation. And then I moved on after that to looking at heteronormativity and how marriage and the nation really devised a heteronormativity as the only norm for the United States. And I got into that and looking at that in marriage and how that ties to the nation. And then eventually when I did my book on same-sex marriage and the security of the nation, it's kind of all that came about through that kind of process. That took a lot of years. But for today, we're just going to look at 5 points. That's the next one. And that is, what is the national security imaginary anyway? What is that? how we construct danger or notions of danger, and recognizing that danger is a social construction. We'll look at that. Then we'll look at the mutual construction of the nation and marriage norms, how those are combined together. And then we'll look last at marriage as a tool of the state and as a normalizing mechanism, and then a few conclusions of that. And then you had a question, I'm sorry. No, you did. I answered your question. That's right. Yes, slide 6 would be perfect. Okay, IR and its conceptualization of the national security imaginary, or what is the national security imaginary? So in mainstream IR, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with international relations, political science, what IR is, but IR is international relations. It's security and the nation state in IR are perceived as a core value. And anarchy is assumed to be the central organizing principle. In other words, there's all these individual nation states floating around in the world in anarchy, and they're all constantly bumping into each other and threatening each other. They're all only interested in themselves. That's another assumption of IR. They're self-interested. They are always considered rational actors to promote their self-interests. It's assumed that their self-interests are very important because life, as Hobbes said, is nasty and brutish and short. So basically, all these states are bumping into each other, constantly creating an environment of insecurity. In other words, the idea is that we should all be afraid. We should always be afraid because there's this constant threat of our security being threatened. Threat from other states that are only interested in themselves at the expense of all other states. These are core assumptions in international relations. So these anarchical relations make security issues absolutely central in the construction of IR. And consequently then, the role of the state in all this anarchy is to make order. Keep us secure is the idea. So it is these IR assumptions, or what scholar Cynthia Weber calls myths, which are responsible for constructing and maintaining the IR security imaginary. So these assumptions or myths in international relations is what helps make a particular view of the world appear to be true. So in other words, the myth function, on the next one now, the myth function of IR security discourse is making a fact out of an interpretation. It's only one, these assumptions are only one way of looking at it. These assumptions are constructed as the truth. They are really, in a sense, myths. They are the way that we imagine security. It's not the only way that security can be thought of, theorized, practiced, etc., etc. So that's why it's called the security imaginary. So the national security imaginary makes what is cultural and disputed into what is considered natural, common sense, or fact. So in other words, the national security imaginary is about the ways we imagine security and not realizing that then it's not natural, it's not the only way. We just assume it to be taken as fact. But it's really not, it's imaginary. So next is the construction of danger. So tied into the ways we imagine security are the ways that we imagine or interpret or construct danger. So according to David Campbell, from his book, Writing Security, United States Foreign Policy and Politics of Identity, he argues that in a security imaginary, the construction of nation and national identity with its exclusions and inclusions determines the ways in which the IR imaginary constructs threats to our nation state, or any nation state. So therefore, danger is not objective. Anything can be a risk. It all depends on how one analyzes the danger and considers the event. Danger is an effect of interpretation. That's huge when you think about it. So this understanding of the necessarily interpretive basis of danger has important implications for IR, global politics, and security. Oh. Sorry. The events or factors such as homosexuality or same-sex marriage that are identified as dangerous come to be ascribed as such only through an interpretation of their various dimensions of dangerousness. Okay, so the text or the discourses that guide national security policy do more than simply offer a strategic analysis of the reality they confront. They actively concern themselves with the scripting of a particular American identity, An American identity that's founded on a stratified, hierarchical society structure, patriarchal and capitalistic in its foundations. And you could picture it, like a pyramid with the people on the top being very few. And the farther you go down the pyramid, the lower classes you go, the more people there are. That in this liberal capitalist structure that we live in, that liberal theory sees this system, even though it's stratified and unequal, as fundamentally sound. That even though equality can only be gained horizontally and never from the top to the bottom, from a small point to where the masses are at the bottom, that the goal is in liberal theory then essentially that equality is then, it's the search for equality that drives us up this unequal stratified system that is supposed to motivate us to try to be more equal with people who have more than us or have more privilege or better status or higher status. Okay, it's even assumed that the people at the top are more valuable and deserve higher status. And think of the amount of force that it takes in a situation in a pyramid like this where there's fewer people at the top and more people at the bottom. You would think that everybody at the bottom was probably going, ooh, I really want to be here. Oh, please let me stay at the bottom. It's so great at the bottom. But they're not. So you have to think about the force that it takes, the social force, the economic situations, the ideological coercion that has to occur to get more people to be at the bottom with less than the fewer people are at the top. Sometimes, actually, physical violence, but usually it's more threats of violence, ideological coercion, etc., that keeps this system perpetuating itself. And so, consequently, American identity is founded on a hierarchical, unequal gender system, racial system, class system, sexual system. And this identity, this system, is critical to the construction of our security imaginary, keeping that in place. Therefore, it was really important when I started all this research to really examine the early construction of the nation. How did this kind of all come about? How did the U.S. start all this? And the history of marriage, and how they ended up being mutually constructed together. And it was really fascinating. That was definitely imperative for answering my research question that drove my research. So consequently, I interrogated the ways in which same-sex marriage is perceived of and represented as alien, subversive, dirty or sick, and as such is pivotal to the articulation of danger in the American experience. So we really do, as a society and as a nation, interpret same-sex marriage and homosexuality as a danger or a threat.